The importance of soil cannot be understated. Human civilizations have been dependent upon the planet's resources, chief among them soil and water. We are heterotrophic organisms that need to eat other food. In theory, we can trace all our meals back to plants and the sun, as only plants and algae are capable of photosynthesis and sustaining themselves. And so it's important to remember that soil and water problems are not limited to local situations. They can cross national borders, and we have seen historically grand civilizations like the Mayan or Aztecs crumble and fall due to bad soil and water availability in a given year. Soil formation is a very long process known as weathering. Weathering gets its name from the gradual breakdown of rock to rubble to the base soil components traditionally done by weather, rain, sleet, snow. It's also accomplished by chemicals and organisms that pre-digest the soil and the ground. It takes a long time. There's an inherent balance required in soil formation. Initial weathering will release nutrients, and this is considered as good, but too much weathering will completely destroy what is left of the parent material and lead to erosion. Initial weathering takes a mountain and breaks it down to rock, sand, silt, clay. These are molecules that have value, but too much weathering renders these small particles too small to hold water or breaks them down to the point where they have no nutritional content left. Soil is a dynamic three-phase system. We need solid material, minerals, to help provide a supportive role in holding the plant's roots together. We also need it as a nutritional source, but there must be pockets of liquid and air for a number of reasons. One, we need water to help absorb nutrients. We also need water for photosynthesis to occur, to keep our plants turgid. And there must be pockets of air to allow for drainage, because stagnant water breeds bacterial growth, as well as to allow for gas exchange. The ideal growing system would be about 50% solid and then a near balance between the liquid and gaseous phases. The different types of particles that exist in soil have different values. Rock has the most nutritional content. It is the most mineral rich, but it does not have any water holding capacity. Clay still has mineral value, but it can absorb a lot of moisture. Silt has some nutritional value, also very good at retaining water. Sand has no nutritional value and no water holding capacity. And so sand is there to help drainage, to ensure that there's pockets of air inside. And in fact, the most productive soils are composed of something known as loam. Loam is equal parts sand, silt, and clay. It is a very rich, crumbly type of topsoil. The idea here is that you have clay for nutrients, silt for water retention, and sand for drainage and air. They're perfectly in balance to ensure that you have a very well-balanced system. While plants make their own food through photosynthesis, and they can make ATP this way and build up starches and sugars, there are still nutrients that they absorb through water and their root structures that are essential. A large number of it is pre-digested and decayed through living organisms in the process known as decomposition. And so what we're doing is we're taking humus, twigs, leaves, other organic matter, decaying roadkill, and breaking it down little by little, composting it, if you will, to create the topsoil, which is very highly nutritious and where all the environmental recycling takes place. If you want a robust lawn, a happy garden, you want 10 to 20% humus availability there to ensure that you have all the nutrients that your growing plants could need or hope for. Soil quality is assessed based upon the nature of the parent material, which largely can be discerned by the color, the climate of the environment nearby, the slope of the land, whether you're mountainside, in a rain shadow, in a valley, what organisms live in the loam, because that's going to determine the productivity of that composting. Time, how long has that soil been weathered? How frequently is it replenished? And then the cultivation practices. How many things have been grown here? What's its history? Has it been used and abused in that time? So we can analyze soil based upon the texture, the structure, the color, the horizon boundaries between sedimentary layers, and the smell. So what I wanted to show here in the diagram is horizons, layers of soil based upon different parent materials. limestone versus calcium versus volcanic rock versus decaying matter versus humus. And we can see on the left the diagram from the textbook, very clear and defined. And then we can see on the diagram on the right a real life example, but there the boundaries are not as easily discernible. Soil comes in 170 recognized shades. And as a general rule, the darker the color, the more organic matter, meaning the more nutrition is there. Soil should have smell. It should have a very earthy, sweet smell. It should reflect the fact that there's decomposition and microbial life and nutrient cycling all taking part in that process. If it smells metallic, almost coppery, that's usually an indication that there's stagnant anaerobic bacteria, and this will lead to root rot. If it smells like a rotten egg, that means that there's high sulfur. This is going to change the acidity of the soil and make it harder for a large number of plants to grow. If there's no smell whatsoever, that means there's not a lot of active life. So you're going to have to invest in that decomposition. You're going to have to fertilize it because on its own, the ground is so nutrient poor that not even bacteria can live there. Erosion is a problem. Erosion is the removal and movement of soil unintentionally, and this happens on a massive scale. 25 billion tons of soil each year are removed from terra firma and deposited elsewhere. And the sad truth is, we are losing soil faster than it's being formed. It takes us roughly 15 years to make 1 cubic centimeter of soil through rain and weathering, and yet we lose 25 billion tons a year. Why are we losing so much? Well, it depends where you live and the soil's characteristics. Certain soils are more likely to be moved by water or rain, but also the local environment. Do you have trees? Is the climate stable? Do you have large seasonal shifts? They will all have an impact. In the past 25 years, half the world's tropical rainforests have been destroyed to make way for agriculture, logging, and urban development. The problem is, by deforesting things, we are removing the root network that holds the soil where it needs to be. So now, when it rains heavily, the dust just washes away. Erosion can occur by wind, rain, gravity. With wind erosion, light, small particles are moved by the force and energy of wind. While it may still be deposited on land, the point is it's not deposited where the wind currently picked it up. And so wind erosion does still change our agriculture locally. 42% of all erosion occurs via wind. And we can see in the bottom panel that the force of sand blowing can break down parent rock and lead to increased weathering, which can create basically a vicious cycle. Too much weathering too fast means we lose that nutritional content, and now we have a lot of dust ready to be picked up and moved elsewhere again. Water erosion is moved by the directionality of the water flow. This accounts for close to half of all erosion. You can see how rivers wind and bend and slowly carve things out in a valley. In the left bottommost panel, we can see the dirt trail carried down into the river. That will eventually settle, but that creates other problems. One, that river will become more and more shallow over time. And two, the excess nitrogen deposited in that water will bind to oxygen and make it harder for fish and other aquatic life to breathe. It's called eutrophication. And then in terms of gravity, if you don't have a lot of trees to hold rocks and roots and dirt together, steep slopes can lead to massive landslides. Interestingly enough, a lot of our solutions are old world solutions. Terracing, for example, is one of the oldest agricultural practices, and yet it's one of the most efficient at ensuring and maximizing water retention and soil retention. The idea here is instead of flattening our earth, we want to build steps into our mountainsides for a number of reasons. One, it allows us to make use of other land that might traditionally be seen as unusable space. But two, it is really hard to get something very, very flat. And so in the top panel, we can see that these plants were planted on a near flat surface, but there is a slight slope to it. And so when it rains heavily, all those new shoots get washed away because the surface area is too large. That diffusion is going to occur very, very slowly in this space. But if we terrace it and cut steps into the mountainside, the surface area to volume ratio is high. So each step acts as a sponge and very rapidly absorbs the water. And so there's no excess pooling on the surface, no ground flooding. Those shoots stay exactly where you planted them and everybody's happy. Another option is strip cropping. In this case, you're not growing one thing in these monoculture times. We're growing at least two things. We alternate close-growing plants with wide-growing ones. This is a very cheap and easy solution. The close-growing plants are going to trap soil, while the wide-growing plants are going to block wind. You are covering your basis in terms of erosion twofold. It also has the added boon of decreasing the likelihood of disease spread between crops. Another solution would be crop rotation. You could grow monoculture plants in this case, but you would want to alternate each field and each year with a different plant, a sister plant, if you will. The idea is you want to use plants that have opposing nutritional requirements. You're alternating soil depleting crops with soil replenishing ones. So the example here is we're going to plant corn in year 1, and corn does not utilize phosphorus and potassium as much. So when you fertilize the ground, it builds a large pool of those resources. In the next year, you would plant alfalfa where you planted corn, and alfalfa loves potassium and phosphorus. Absorb a lot of that, bringing those numbers and levels back to a much more optimal growth rate. And then in year 3, we put corn back in, and that's going to replenish the soil again. And then in year 4, we use alfalfa again. The idea here is not only can we reduce disease spread, because over the course of an entire year, if there were any root rot or any blights specific to corn or alfalfa, those things would die off. But the other thing we can do is we can decrease how often we have to fertilize. Instead of annually, we could get away with doing it maybe every other year. Unfortunately, the more people we have, and we have 7 billion at present, the more houses we need to build, the more factories, the more cars, the more things we need to utilize to keep people happy, fed, clothed, sustainable. And this results in higher and higher concentration of sulfuric acid and nitric acids being released into our atmosphere. Them being released into the atmosphere is not so much a problem. It's what happens when they are up there and they bond with the excess water molecules. What goes up must come down, but it doesn't always have to come down in the same form that it went up in. And so what we see is sulfur dioxide often comes down as sulfuric acid. Nitric oxide often comes down altered, and this creates acid rain. This is changing the pH of our water, of the rainfall, and it's having downstream effects on the plant life and animals nearby. Water is supposed to have a pH of 7, be a perfect balance between acid and base. But the average rainfall in the United States has an acidic pH of 4.3. Both terrestrial and aquatic organisms are harmed by this high acidity. For example, acid fog bleaches leaves, killing the chlorophyll inside, making it so that they cannot photosynthesize as often and trees can die. Indirectly, the excess acids break down calcium, potassium, magnesium, other elements in the soil, creating a nutrient poor substrate for plants to grow in. These are all essential nutrients for plants, and so plants don't get the necessary nutrition that they need, and they cannot grow as robustly. In terms of preventing acid rain, what we really want to do is reduce our emissions, carpool where possible, improve our energy efficiency so we're not relying upon coal and wood-burning stoves, switching to natural gas, renewable energy where we can. The next thing is moving towards modern solutions. We can add scrubbers to our factories to help leach out the sulfur and nitrogen so that they don't complex as frequently. The scrubbers extract hot gases and function like sponges, removing them before they release clean oxygen and carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. This leads to less being converted to the dangerous acid rain forms. The greenhouse effect, or global warming, describes a process whereby the energy from the sun warms the earth. It actually gets trapped in our atmosphere and prevents it from leaving. There are different gases that absorb this energy more than others. Carbon dioxide and methane are our 2 biggest offenders. They get trapped in our atmosphere and continue to reflect back the sun's heat onto the planet, even when we're not facing the sun. They act like glass panels that make up the roof of a greenhouse, hence the name. If you've ever walked into a greenhouse and felt that sweltering heat, that is what these gases are doing to our planet. They are effectively acting like blankets, cloaking our planet and keeping it hot. Global warming is not something that just happened. There's been evidence of our atmosphere warming dating to the 1700s. This has been 300 years and counting. The average temperature has increased more drastically in the last 50 years. The last 10 hottest years on record have occurred in the last 20, 30 years. Each year, we're setting new record highs, telling us that things are getting worse. Who's to blame? Largely us. We have increased the amount of greenhouse gases by burning fossil fuels at an astronomical rate. We need to clear land to cultivate crops, to feed the masses. But in burning trees, we are releasing carbon dioxide, that pesky greenhouse gas, at a faster rate than the remaining trees can clean that carbon dioxide and return it to oxygen. As we move forward, we can anticipate a 10-degree increase in temperature. Hotter days will lead to less rainfall. Droughts will be more frequent and more severe. As ice caps melt, sea levels will rise. 7 to 24 inches may not seem like a lot, but there are places like New Orleans that are below sea level that would be completely gone. Migratory birds will get their cues to arrive back before the thaws, when food might be scarce or not available at all. And as things get warmer, birds and insects will begin to expand their geographic ranges as more and more new environments become hospitable to them. A resource is a living or non-living thing that's used to meet our needs and wants. Resources are classified as either renewable or non-renewable. Renewable resources can or will be replenished naturally in the course of time, readily and rapidly replenished. So things like solar power, wind, water, plants, and animals, if they have high enough reproductive rates, would be considered renewable resources because we can anticipate them on a fairly regular basis. Non-renewable resources are those that are not sustainable because their formation takes too long, often hundreds, thousands, or billions of years. We're talking about our fossil fuels, oil, salt, gas, and some plants and animals that have long lifespans but low reproductive rates. And so if we want to continue to exist in a world, in an ecosystem of balance, we have to consider conservation, the effort of preserving what we have. And we haven't done a great job of this. We have terms like endangered or threatened species to describe those animals that are at risk of immediate extinction. The distinction between an endangered and threatened animal is that the endangered species is at risk for immediate extinction, while the threatened is likely to become endangered soon. What leads them to these classifications? Typically, it's the result of habitat destruction, overutilization, or overpredation. While not at immediate risk, flagship species are those that garner a lot of attention. These are considered charismatic animals or popular animals that people can get behind and support, even if they're not at risk. Extinction is a natural process. Each species has a finite lifetime. Probably 99% of all organisms that have existed are now extinct. Most species tend to thrive for roughly 2 to 5 million years, at which time the world has changed enough that they are no longer suitable in this environment. Extinction can result in an available ecological niche being opened up for the rise of a new species, paving the way to an ever-changing world. There are two types of extinctions. Know the difference between background extinction and mass extinction. Background extinction is the continuous low-level rate of extinction, the simple disappearance of a species or two every so many years. A mass extinction, on the other hand, is the disappearance of a whole number of species, a large loss of diversity in a very brief geological period of time. So let's take a look at our historic record. Since the dawn of Earth recorded history, we've noted 5 mass extinction events, periods where upwards of 75% of the species died off. We find ourselves today in the 6th extinction event, wherein humans are the primary cause of species die-off, and this is occurring at a rate much greater than that of the Cretaceous period. Roughly 2,400 species are disappearing daily, and while we are describing 10,000 new species every year, the die-off is occurring much more readily. Why? Well, a number of our routine activities, such as expanding and industrialization, logging, and clearing land for agriculture, result in habitat loss for other species. As we've moved, we've introduced new species to the area because we rely upon them for domesticated services or crops, and this comes with it new challenges and competition. And with a population of 7 billion, we are over-harvesting a lot of our resources and creating a lot of waste and pollution that leads to global changes. Habitat loss refers to any land alteration, and this could be because we're clearing trees to make way for agriculture, or we are clearing swaths of land so we can build up cities. We might be replacing the natural forest with copses of trees for lumber, build shelters, or to mine resources. And sometimes we may not be using that land at all, but the human activities nearby lead to increased pollution, making that land unsuitable. Looking at Madison County, Alabama, we can see that over the span of 40 years, the urbanization of Alabama changed the proportion of that area from green, underdeveloped land to blue, developed land. And more than just the proportion of the landscape changing, we can also see fragmentation. Many small pockets of land remain, but this is not necessarily suitable to the organism. Conservation works when you have a large enough area preserved to maintain a species. The critical habitat is the area required to maintain not just that species, but the suite of species that make up the ecosystem, that participate in the predator-prey dynamics, that participate in the recycling of particular nutrients. And so we can see in this diagram of the mangroves, it's not just one habitat we're preserving, the nursery habitat or the foraging habitat or the nesting habitat, but different species live within this community, and each one plays a role in maintaining the overall health and balance of this community. The problem with fragmentation is it increases dangers in the area. It cuts off organisms from either their food source or their herd, creating smaller populations that have a higher risk of local extinction. On the left, we can see a fictional depiction of fragmentation, which occurred in the classic children's tale, The Land Before Time, separating Littlefoot from his family. Now, while this chasm was clearly death-defying, a corridor that a road creates between a community is equally dangerous for the wildlife that passes. And this leads us to the next concept, edge effects. This is the transition range between environments. This is an area with increased dangers and generally less animals because they die off as a result of being unsuitable for living in close proximity to humans. The diagram at the bottom shows how if a habitat patch is large enough, the edge effect is relatively small in comparison, and so organisms can still thrive and survive in that environment. But if your fragments are small, the edge effect might constitute the vast majority of this region, rendering that location virtually useless. When we talk about introduced species, it's important to denote that sometimes we intentionally move things and sometimes we accidentally move them. But in either case, these new species tend to aggressively outcompete the native plants and animals. The diagram on the right at the top shows the zebra mussel migration from the Great Lakes down through the Mississippi. And zebra mussels are largely invasive. They completely destroy not just aquatic habitats along the marine coast, but even freshwater habitats. Their shells can grow through the piping and puncture it, leading to massive flooding and commercial expenses. The bottom figure is the invasive North American mink brought in for trapping and its fur, and it has been, this one species has been partly or wholly responsible for the extinction of at least 68 bird species over the last 500 years. The harvesting of wild organisms are occurring at rates exceeding the ability of the population to rebound. This is particularly true for animals with low reproductive rates, such as fish, whales, elephants, and sharks, animals with long lifespans that have only 1 or 2 offspring at a time, punctuated by many years in between these births. Presently, there are less than 12,000 blue whales left worldwide. The unregulated killing of wolves have left them endangered in 48 of the 50 states, and every single shark species has declined since the 1970s, largely due to the harvesting of their fin for shark fin soup, a delicacy in Asia. And that has since been banned by many countries. But we continue to deplete shark numbers with the assumption that sharks are dangerous and they need to be regulated. Their population must be controlled. But this is not the case. There's roughly only 11 shark attacks annually, and we are killing close to 1,100 a day through our deep sea trawling and through our overfishing, which disrupts their food chain. Over the years, we've tried a number of response efforts, beginning with the Endangered Species Act in 1973. The government attempted to protect the disappearing animals and plants, identifying those at risk as endangered to be highly protected and federally a crime if you touched them, approached them, or harmed them. More than 900 species of plants and animals are identified and protected in the United States, with an additional 500 so along the globe. We've also created zoned reservations. These are protected regions that are relatively undisturbed. They have surrounding buffer zones to prevent those edge effects and any other further intrusion or harm. We've also created safe corridors between fragments within this area so animals can move freely and safely. And the idea is that in a zoned reservation, the ecosystems will be naturally balanced and self-regulating. On the left is a picture of Yellowstone National Park. There's the large area that is the park where many people can come and be tourists and explore, but there's also an area within this that is a zoned reservation that people cannot go to, and this allows for the animals to move freely and safely. The picture on the right is a zoned reservation that was created to provide a life of dignity and contentment for rescued animals. This sanctuary is 720 acres just outside of Denver, and it's for retired circus animals. They could not be re-released to the wild. Relatively new is restoration. This is an attempt to return an ecosystem to its pre-disturbed state. This is considered adaptive management. Essentially, humans intervene, see if it helps, get worse, makes no difference. We currently have our first restoration event happening in the Mississippi River Delta. We changed the way the Mississippi River flowed to make it more accessible for shipping, and as a result, it has increased erosion events. A football field of wetlands vanishes into the Gulf of Mexico almost every hour. This has downstream consequences, such as eutrophication of the water, creating pockets of no oxygen, but also it is making the Gulf of Mexico shallower and shallower, so it's going to eventually make it near impossible for us to ship things through there. The concerns about restoration are threefold. One, the cost. It is immensely expensive to pump up the soil out of the Gulf of Mexico and rebuild the coastline and the riverbanks. There's also the concern about the attention to detail. Have we considered all the things? Scientists are trying to make this as self-sufficient as possible by moving a number of trees across the banks to ensure erosion doesn't occur, that the soil is locked down, and that there's enough genetic diversity present that natural evolution will continue to maintain this. But there is the question, when we stop intervening, will this maintain itself? And we don't know yet. It's too soon to say. Another thing we've been doing is genetically modifying organisms. Now, it's important to point out that genetic modification has always been a thing. When we control bred mustard greens to create broccoli and cauliflower and kale, that is a type of genetic modification. Even sex is a type of genetic modification, in which case two organisms swap a whole bunch of genetic information and you don't know what you're getting. Selective breeding of domesticated dogs is a type of genetic modification. The benefit of technology is that now we can genetically engineer a species by moving a desirable trait instantaneously. We can remove all those intermediates that are near hits or near misses, and we know exactly what we moved, exactly where it's going, and we can get exactly what we want every time and confirm it. What are the types of things that we're relocating? Genes for pesticide resistance, genes for drought resistance. The idea is we want to make plants hardier so that they can thrive in less than ideal environments on their own without as much intervention by humans, without as much fertilization, without as much pesticide spray, without as much watering. These traits naturally exist in the world, but if we waited for pollination and natural selection to bring it to the foods that we actually ingest, we might be waiting a long time and it might be too late. Genetic modification allows us to cut out the middleman of time, and perhaps that's what we will need to rapidly respond to the changes in our environment today. Another solution is germplasm preservation, in which case we are storing seeds, tissues, living cultures, maintaining them cryogenically frozen or dehydrated, with the idea that if the world goes to hell in a handbasket, we might be able to reconstitute life on Earth in a similar fashion. Or should we get interstellar travel, we would be able to bring these seeds to a new environment and colonize a new planet. Worldwide, germplasm collections contain about 7.4 million accessions of plant genetic resources for food and agriculture. All of these endeavors speak to a resounding, important truth. Biodiversity is important. It is the underpinning of a healthy, functioning ecosystem. It requires knowledge of the origin of species, the extent of the variation, and how it might be maintained. Without a biologically diverse world, humans will not exist. Biodiversity provides an array of services that maintain life on Earth, a diversity of crops that fulfill our varied nutritional needs, a diversity of domestic animals that give life meaning and value. A number of plants serve as a source of medicines. Natural products such as wildlife, fish, and timber we rely upon for not just food, but shelter as well. And more than anything, we need diversity because the variation that exists in the wild is the raw material upon which natural selection can occur. We don't know what tomorrow will bring, and so we need to maintain diversity so that in the event the environment changes, there's a chance that one of us carries a mutation that will thrive and ensure continuity of life. No matter what changes occur, life will go on. This is a process known as succession. Know the difference between primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession occurs in an environment in which new substrate, devoid of any vegetation and usually lacking soil itself, becomes hospitable. Primary succession describes the weathering process of changing bare rock like that from a recent lava flow or earthquake and slowly breaking it down to create topsoil. From here, that bare soil is a harsh environment, and so not all plants can survive there. Budding sprouts would likely dry out too quickly as a result of nothing blocking the sun's heat and penetrating gaze. There are very few plants that can withstand these tough circumstances. We call them weeds, but in science they're known as pioneer species. Pioneering plants are really water efficient. They can retain a large amount of moisture from a very brief amount of rainfall, and as they grow and die, they start to enrich the soil, which increases moisture, allowing more weeds to grow more densely, creating shaded pockets for new species to emerge. The pioneer species paved the way for secondary succession. This is where the community changes that previously colonized habitat, and we start to see intermediate species, grasses, shrubs, pines, give way to mature forests. But there is a point of no return. Ecosystems can bounce back. Disturbances can be reversible, but to a point. Keep in mind that any extinction of species along the way do not return. And so while the land might become hospitable again, while succession will ensure that life does go on, what that life looks like, what the flora and fauna result in may be wholly different. And extinction events are not limited to just one thing. Remember how no population exists in isolation. The death of one species will have downstream effects on another.